Hello again, scholars. So, welcome to the video for our grammar notes introduction to verbs. Now, verbs, not orbs. Thank you, printer. So we're just going to really quickly go through, some characteristics about verbs, as well as some really simple, basic information on how you conjugate a verb, which we'll talk about what that means in just a second. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So verbs in Latin and in English have a total of 5 characteristics. Okay? These characteristics are person, okay, which you know from like English class. First person is I am telling a story. Third person, you're talking about other people. So these are terms that should be familiar to you. So the first characteristic is person. The second characteristic is number. Number just means whether it's singular or plural. Other languages have more than just these two numbers. For instance, ancient Greek has another number here in the middle called the dual. So, not all languages do it this way, but it just so happens that English and Latin do have the same number for number, singular versus plural. Okay. Next, all verbs show tense. Okay, these are the 6 tenses in Latin. We'll talk a little bit more about in, I think, the next video. But for now, just know that the third characteristic of every verb is tense, when the action happened. Okay. Next, probably the trickiest one for most of us to get our heads around is number 4, which we call mood. Okay, mood has nothing to do with like how you feel when the verb is happening. Instead, it just sort of describes the circumstances of the verb. So for instance, the indicative mood, which most verbs are indicative, by the way, it's right there in the name. It indicates, it shows that an action occurs. Whether it's going to happen in the future, whether it happened in the past, whether it happens right now. It's showing the fact that an action happens. Okay? The second one here, the imperative, just is the command form. You veteran scholars will recognize probably the Latin vocab word imperator, like the emperor. The emperor orders you to do stuff, right? So the imperative mood is the mood that we use for commanding people to do things. The third mood that is fairly common in Latin is what's called the infinitive. The infinitive, the easiest way to think of it is this is the to form. So to verb, right? To verb or not to verb. That is the infinitive. Now, that's all we're going to talk about in just a minute separately anyway. So that will suffice for now. The fourth and final mood in Latin is called the subjunctive. No, not all of you scholars have gotten to the subjunctive yet, but when we do, you'll notice that the subjunctive is just the mood that we use for describing an action that is sort of, it's currently unreal, by which I mean it could be true, it might be true, it should happen, would happen, may happen, might happen, but we're not saying that it is happening, we're saying that it could, or it might, or it should. Okay, in English, you can tell there's a bunch of ways to do that in the English language, but we have to add a whole separate word to make it subjunctive. In Latin, we don't. We just kind of change a letter or two usually. So we'll get to that a little bit later in a separate video. Don't worry about that. Now, the final mood that we have is, or excuse me, the final characteristic that we have for Latin and English verbs is called voice. Okay? So it's either active or passive. Right? If the action is done, the subject performs the action, or maybe it is performed by somebody else. Okay? Let's go ahead and move swiftly along to our personal endings. Okay? Again, this is a review for most of us, but even if it's the first time you're seeing it, we're just going to really quickly look at how verbs are put together. Okay? So to show who's doing the action of any verb, English uses a personal pronoun, as you know. Right? Words like I, you, he, she, it. But in Latin, the Romans had pronouns, but they didn't have to use them the way that English does. Instead, they used personal endings on their verbs. Okay? They're personal because they show the person that is doing the action. Again, it's not a specific human being, it's just first person, second person, third person. I, you, he, she, it, and so forth. Okay? Now this is really, really important. When a verb has an ending, right? When you put an ending onto a verb in Latin, it is called a conjugated verb. Okay? Probably a good idea to circle that. Put some stars next to it. Maybe draw an arrow to it, so you don't forget. This is a major term that we're going to use over and over and over again. So make sure you know what a conjugated verb is. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at how you conjugate a verb, how you put the ending on. Well, what are those endings for starters? So just the regular, the very basic endings for the present tense that we all learn first are O, S, T, mus, tis, nt, or sometimes we say nt. Okay? That's what the way the Latin verb will end to show its first person, second person, third person, and so forth. Now, when we translate that back into English, though, English doesn't have a lot of verb endings, right? We have like one in the present tense. Instead, we have to use those personal pronouns. So for first person singular, it's I, right? For second person singular, it's you. For third person singular, we have three options. It could be he, it could be she, or it could be it, right? One of the very few places in English that we still show gender is our personal pronouns. Okay, for first person plural, mus is we. Second person plural, tis, is a little tricky because we don't really have a standard form for this in English anymore. So we have to say something like you all, or y'all, or you guys, or something. Different dialects have different ways to do it because we do not have a standard form for that anymore. And finally, third person plural is they. Okay? So go ahead and move to the next page where we talk about how exactly, or what, the way that we conjugate verbs and how we group them. Okay? So verbs are grouped by their conjugation. So all verbs belong to one of four groups called conjugations. Okay? And they're called conjugations because they conjugate, they are conjugated in a specific way. Okay? So as we say up here, the conjugations, each individual one shows that they share the same stem vowel that we'll talk about in a second, and they show the same vowel patterns in their conjugation. Okay, all that means is within each group, they conjugate the same way. Okay, so for starters, let's look at how we identify what conjugation a verb belongs to. Okay, to do that, we go to the infinitive that we'll talk about that down here, what that means. But you go to the infinitive, and probably the easiest way is to chop off the RE. Right? The last two letters are RE on your infinitive. You chop those letters off, and whatever vowel you are left with is your stem vowel. In every verb that's in the first conjugation, the stem vowel is a long A. In the second conjugation, do the same thing. Your stem vowel is a long E. Third conjugation, same deal. It's a short E, though. And then for fourth, it's a long I. Okay? This is one of those things that scholars tend to overlook the first time we learn all this stuff in Latin, because honestly, at first it doesn't seem all that important. But the farther into the language you get, the more you realize you really, really need to know, just by looking at it, what conjugation a verb belongs to. for all kinds of different reasons. So the sooner you can internalize, just by looking at it, what conjugation a verb is a part of, the easier your life will be, okay? And as we said, to conjugate a verb just means to put the personal endings on the verb stem. The verb stem is the piece that you're left with when you chop off the RE, okay? So let's look at the infinitive for a second here. So in order to conjugate a verb, right, you have to know its infinitive, okay? Almost always ends in the letters RE. We'll learn some exceptions this year, but for now, you look for the form that has an RE at the end, all right? Again, in English, we translate this as to verb. To verb or not to verb, that is the infinitive, okay? I'll give you a couple of examples here. So we're going to use laudare, which you can tell by that long A, is a member of the first conjugation. Laudare we would translate as to praise. Okay, monere over here, again you see that long E, so it's a member of the second conjugation. We translate it as to warn. Okay, that will come in handy a little bit later with your practice at the bottom. Okay, now let's look at how we conjugate the verbs. Okay, so right now we're just focusing on the present tense. The next video we'll talk about the next couple tenses, but for now, in the present tense, this is always true. To conjugate the verb, you go to the infinitive, right? So laudare, you chop off the RE, and you're left with what is called the stem. Okay? So, excuse me. So when we're conjugating, the first thing we can do is actually just write the stem in, and then we can just go back and put the endings in, just to do it separately. The only thing is, for reasons known best to the Romans, the very first one of the very first conjugation of the very first person is actually an exception to the rule. This one's a little tricky, only because it doesn't follow the rule. But I'll show you a trick here in just a second. So you can skip first person singular for now, but you can write in the stem for the rest of them. Okay? And so for the very first one, it's really not that big of a deal. All you have to remember is instead of including your stem vowel like you do for the rest, for second person, third person, and then all of the plurals, you just take off the A. But this is only true for the first conjugation. Every other conjugation, you don't have to worry about this step. Right? You can just use the stem with some exceptions we'll talk about a little bit later, because there's always exceptions, right? So go ahead and we can write in our endings now, our present tense endings from the last page. So O, S, T, mus, tis, NT. Some of you veteran scholars might remember the long marks do remain here for a couple of the forms. Not going to get into why. Not super important for meaning to write those in, so don't worry about that for now. Now we can go ahead and translate the verb. We have everything we need, right? We know that our verb, laudare, means to praise, and we know that each of our personal endings stands for a different person, right? So I, you, he, she, it, we, you all, and they. So to translate, you just put those two pieces together, right? So laudo, we would translate as I, because of the long O, I laudare, praise. Okay, I praise. Laudas, you praise. Right? Because that S stands for you in English, and then our verb means the same thing. So you praise. For third person, remember we have those three options for our pronoun. So very often the way we write it is just a shorthand HSI, he, she, or it praises. You see the one spot in the present tense where English still has a verb ending, yay! And the rest of them real quick, we have we, you all, and they. Praise. Just do that. Ditto marks there for us. Okay? On the next page, we have the exact same thing, except with, with a second conjugation verb, monere, that we already looked at. Okay? So go ahead, you might, if you want, you can pause the video right here. Go ahead and try it yourself, and I'll show you in just a second here if this already filled in, just to save a little time for you. Okay? And welcome back. Here we go. Here is the completely filled in forms for moneo monere. You notice as a second conjugation verb, it keeps that stem vowel in all of them, right? In first conjugation, in the first person singular, you have to get rid of it, okay? But in the second, you don't have to worry about that. It stays there. Okay. So go ahead and we'll move on swiftly here. One more thing to look at is the present imperative. Again, the imperative, remember, is the command form. Commands in Latin are actually really easy. So you do the same steps you've been doing. You conjugate the verb, you find the infinitive, chop off the re, you're left with the stem, and then you're actually done. In Latin, the stem is actually the exact same as the present imperative, or excuse me, the singular imperative, i.e. when you're telling one person to do something. So in this instance, lauda would, if you walked into a room full of Romans and shouted lauda to one person, you would be telling them to praise someone, right? Praise. Now, if you're talking to that whole room of Romans, to pluralize it, all you have to do is add te. So instead of lauda, you have laudate. So in English, it sounds the same. It sounds exactly the same. We don't have a difference between singular and plural imperatives in the English language. So laudate, you would still translate as praise. All right? So do this real quick with moneo monere, second conjugation verb. So we go to our infinitive, which is right here. We chop off the re, and we're done. Right? Mone means mourn. If we wanted to tell a bunch of people to say that, we have our stem, and we just add that te. Monete, which is just worn again. Okay? So there's one extra little piece down here at the bottom. Really, I probably should have mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I put it down here for space reasons. Basically, I wanted to remind you that the principal parts of a verb are very, very, very important. Whenever you learn new Latin vocabulary, you learn them with four principal parts if they are a verb. Okay, so first conjugation verbs, you learn them like this: laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. That's the four principal parts. Second conjugation: moneo, monere, monui, monetum. Okay, four principal parts. You have to know the four principal parts because each of those parts is used for something. Okay, so for example, you probably already noticed the second principal part is the infinitive, right? The one we've been using this whole time. We're going to talk about in the next video that you use the second principal part, the infinitive, to conjugate verbs in the the first group with the present tense, right? So the present, the future, and the imperfect tense, right? We'll talk about all of those next time. So in other words, you need this part to conjugate a whole group of verbs. The third part, same deal. This is what's called the perfect stem. So we use the perfect stem for, go figure, the perfect tense, the pluperfect, and the future perfect as well. So the other three tenses. Okay, so both of these parts are really important. And then the last part is the participle stem that we use kind of like an adjective. We'll talk about that later. And so then we're just left with the first principal part, which is always, always, always the present tense, first person singular, and then it's active and indicative. So in other words, it's really helpful for a first conjugation verb because it actually shows you the fact that that stem vowel goes away, right? The A, when you conjugate it, this should be laudao, right, if it followed the pattern, but it's not. So this is kind of a tip to remind you, oh yeah, that's a first conjugation verb, right? But if, on the other hand, scholars, if all you do is memorize the first principal part, well then you don't know these other parts, so you don't know how to conjugate the verb, right? So really important that you're memorizing those, okay? Good, that's all we're gonna look at for now. I'm gonna make a separate video for the last page of this, this exercise that'll be a lot shorter, but anyway, thanks for watching. As always, if you have any questions, please do email me or feel free to join one of our Zoom meetings. All right, thank you, scholars. I will talk to you next time.